This overview of textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible is designed for the student who aspires to be a competent exegete and work in a ministry of teaching and preaching the Scriptures. This overview and the associated materials is interested in both practical ideals and practical realities. By ideals, what I have in mind is using the most reliable academic materials available for textual criticism, and so that has some of the student ideal in mind too, to understand the state of the art and how to go about textual criticism. But I am also interested in practical realities, that is, recognizing which books a person can afford to buy and learning a method that also can work in ministry context, not just at a university with a library. So we'll be working with both then, the practical ideals of things that really can only be done in a program, and practical realities, thinking through how to work out a system for the person that needs to preach and teach every week. The primary goals for textual criticism include establishing an authoritative text which serves as the basis for preaching and teaching. In addition, we want to understand the early history relative to the textual evidence of a passage. At the same time, there's also some corollary exegetical benefits of text criticism that the student should carefully consider. The main principle is that textual difficulties of all sorts, invite exegetical solutions. Now, because textual difficulties invite exegetical solutions, then the same kinds of things that the ancient scribes did to improve texts, whether by smoothing things out, harmonizing things, or even theological improvements, those are the same kinds of interpretive tendencies that we find within interbiblical exegesis of the Hebrew Bible, Second Temple interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, and New Testament interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And so textual criticism is one way for the exegetically oriented preacher or teacher to begin to focus on these difficulties which have always invited exegetical solutions. Tove is correct that text criticism really needs a goal. The text critic needs to know what is being aimed at. Now, my thought is that the philosophical issues are very complicated, and so this should be worked out in a close discussion, working with the philosophical issues within a formal academic setting. So my purpose here is not to lay out, here's what the goal should be, but rather to take 5 of the kinds of goals that are put out by Bruce Waltke that represent the field. Now, the focus on the original text, that would be the traditional approach, which goes for recovering what the author wrote originally. Focusing on the final text, as opposed to the original text, gets at the idea that since the Old Testament was written over a 1,000-year period, there are some authorized redactions that are a part of it. So the final text then, in the end, based on the evidence we have, is going to be an eclectic text, putting together the final authoritative text when it was put together in the early Second Temple period. So this is going to include some emendations, perhaps not as many as in the older Biblia Hebraica approaches, but this would recognize like the modern English Bible Committee translations like the NRSV and so on. These are eclectic texts which make some emendations as they go along. To focus on the canonical text is a bit of a later step. This gets to the scriptures in the Proto-Masoretic tradition in the times of the New Testament. And a strong advocate of this would be Childs, particularly. And so this doesn't go as far back, but this says to go with the accepted standard in the Proto-Masoretic traditions. Another way to go is toward the earliest attested texts. Now, this would exclude conjectures. That is, there's no emendations toward a non-existent text. And this is a very attractive to many, and it reflects the UBS Text Project, BHQ apparatus, and also the Hebrew University apparatus projects. Finally, more people are arguing for pluriformity. That is, that the evidence doesn't point towards one fixed text, but multiple authoritative text traditions in the Second Temple period. These would include the Proto-Masoretic, the Qumran, the Septuagint, and even the sectarian text, the Samaritan Pentateuch. My point at the moment is that it's important to have a goal, and this is a way to divide up 5 of the normal kinds of goals, and a person should understand these and also have good reasons for the approach taken. The first step in textual criticism is evaluating the external evidence. Now, evaluating the external evidence begins by securing the external evidence. And a good place for the student to start is with the Biblia Hebraica apparatus. Whether the BHQ and or BHS is a good place to start. The apparatus collects a lot of the relevant data for the student, and it's at least a minimal place to go. Beyond this, it is worthwhile to look at the biblical texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Septuagintal witnesses, and in the case of Pentateuchal variations, the Samaritan Pentateuch as well. Each of these can be compared and are very important when comparing it with the Masoretic tradition and the Proto-Masoretic tradition. Each of these are very old. It's also possible, it's also a good idea for really significant projects to go even further and look at some of the other witnesses like the Targums, the Vulgate, and the Peshitta. But at least I would think that the Masoretic and the other Second Temple traditions should be consulted. After collecting the external evidence and evaluating it, then there's a need to evaluate internal evidence. And this amounts to a close study of the scriptures themselves based upon the various external evidence that's available. This would include grammatical and linguistic issues, contextual issues, and all of this requires study of the passage in relation to its context and also in relation to related contexts. There's always questions of an accidental versus an intentional corruption by the scribes. And then when we get at the former of these, accidental, part of the question to answer is what factors could explain an accidental scribal variation? When we talk about intentional changes, things done on purpose, now we need to get at what sorts of motives could explain these scribal improvements. The scribes weren't thinking to themselves, the text needs to be corrupted. Rather, they're thinking what their job is to improve the text, whether it be grammatical improvements, harmonistic improvements, theological improvements. And so part of figuring this out is getting at the motives that seem to be at work in the sort of improvement that's found. And then finally, it's especially worthwhile to notice that we can work with reliable commentaries and other studies. So this is another way into thinking through the logic of the variations. After evaluating the external evidence and evaluating the internal evidence, a decision needs to be made. We need to exegete and preach and teach every week. Our decisions, though, we should keep them provisional and keep from arrogance, and also stay away from being closed-minded. And some of the normal principles involved, they don't always work and we have to be cautious, but these are some of the normal logics. The more difficult reading is often preferred. And that is, we can see why a scribe might make something easier, but it's less likely that a scribe made something more difficult. Also, shorter readings are usually preferred over longer readings. Usually things aren't left out. Rather, things are ancient scribes would often embellish or be expansionistic. And then McCarter raises a really good point getting at the sort of logic we make to make the decisions by asking the question, which reading is more likely to give rise to the others? And we need to run the logic in the different directions based upon what we've uncovered in the external and the internal evidence investigation. Quality text criticism that's a part of responsible exegesis not only realizes how important the authoritative scriptures are, but there are certain attitudes and tendencies that are required. These things take patience. It's not something that we can just type into Google and get the answer. It requires sustained study and real thoughtful understanding of the scriptures themselves and also the work of the scribes. And this is especially a place where we need to be as dispassionate as we can and to be open to consideration of evidence and potential solutions. That is, we need to be careful and guard against our own preferences and prejudices when we do this work. And like anything else, practice, experience, continued study, these always improve our work, and things become easier when we regularly engage in text criticism. And I also suggest always taking the long view. When we do our studies, we need to look at the bigger picture of the whole scriptures and our entire project as ministers of the Word, not just what we need to accomplish for this week.